"Help me! They took all my clothes!" Fat Girl begged, the most feared mountain man. The scream tore through the autumn woods like the cry of a dying animal. "Please, don't! Please!" Molly Brennan stumbled onto the dirt road, barefoot and bleeding, clutching the torn remains of her shirt to her chest. Her pale skin was streaked with mud, her heavy body trembling in the cold. The echo of cruel laughter still rang behind her, fading into the trees. Jake Murdoch's voice was the last thing she remembered clearly, low, mocking, drunk with power. "You think you're too good for me, you fat sow? Let's see how proud you are when everyone sees what you really are." Then came the ripping of fabric, the sting of cold air, the roar of humiliation that burned worse than pain. Now, as twilight bled through the pines, Molly staggered forward, half naked, half mad with terror. Every rustle made her flinch, every gust of wind scraped her skin raw. She didn't know where she was, only that Deadwood lay miles away and that no one in town would believe her. They never did. She was too big, too plain, too strange to be worth defending. When the branches behind her snapped, she froze. Out of the shadows stepped a giant. He was enormous, broad as a wagon door, with a thick black beard and a face marked by a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. His eyes, cold and gray, locked on hers. Her breath hitched. This was Ezra Blackthorn, the beast of the Black Hills. Men whispered his name like a curse. Molly sank to her knees, voice breaking. "Please, help me. They took everything from me." Ezra's stare didn't waver. For a heartbeat, the forest held its breath. Then he unclasped his heavy coat, stepped forward, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. For a long moment, Molly couldn't look up. The coat was far too large for her, swallowing her body completely, the rough fur brushing against her neck like warmth she didn't deserve. Her fingers gripped the edges so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ezra crouched down so he could see her face. His voice was deep, gravelly, not cruel, just heavy with something old and tired. "Who did this?" Her lip quivered. "Jake Murdoch, and the men with him?" Ezra's jaw clenched, his scar tightening across his cheek. "They're still in Deadwood?" She nodded. "They said they'd make sure I learned my place." Her throat caught on the words. "I didn't even do anything, I just said no." He stood to his full height, towering, terrifying and silent. The trees seemed to shrink around him. For a moment, Molly thought she'd made a mistake asking him for help. Every story she'd ever heard about Ezra Blackthorn came rushing back. That he'd once killed 3 men in a single fight, that he'd lived with wolves, that even outlaws crossed the street when he came into town. But when he looked at her again, something unexpected flickered in his eyes. Not pity, not disgust, something closer to recognition. "Can you walk?" he asked. I think so." He turned toward the deeper woods. "My cabin's 2 miles from here. You'll come with me." Molly froze. "To your cabin?" "It's that or freeze out here," he said simply, his voice flat with fact, not threat. "I won't hurt you, girl." She hesitated. The last man who had said those words had done exactly that. But this one, this enormous scarred man, had given her his only coat without asking for anything in return. "Okay," she whispered. The walk was slow, each step agonizing. Her bare feet bled from the rocks and thorns, but Ezra said nothing, just matched her pace. When she stumbled, his hand caught her elbow, firm, careful, like a man holding a glass he didn't want to break. As they neared his cabin, The smell of pine smoke drifted through the air. The small log house stood in a clearing, half hidden by trees, with an axe buried in a stump and firewood stacked neatly beside the door. Ezra opened it and gestured inside. "There's water in the basin. Sit by the fire." Molly stepped over the threshold, her breath catching. The cabin was tidy, not at all what she expected. Books on a shelf, a rifle above the door, a small wooden cradle tucked in the corner, empty and covered with dust. Whose cradle is that?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "My daughter's. She didn't make it through the fever." The air went still. Molly turned toward him, realizing there was grief behind that scarred face. Grief deeper than anger could ever reach. "I'm sorry," she said. Ezra only nodded and handed her a folded blanket. "You'll clean up, eat something, then sleep. Tomorrow I'll make this right." Molly blinked. "You mean you'll go after them?" He looked at her, eyes burning like smoldering coals. "What they did to you isn't just wrong, it's evil, and I don't let evil breathe in my woods." She didn't know what scared her more, the cold promise in his tone or the warmth she suddenly felt at knowing someone finally cared enough to fight for her. That night, wrapped in his coat by the fire, Molly cried silently, not from fear this time, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. The next morning, a pale mist rolled over the pines, curling like ghostly fingers around the cabin. Molly woke to the crackle of fire and the smell of coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the memories came flooding back. The laughter, the tearing fabric, the cold. Her body tensed. "Easy," Ezra said from near the hearth. His voice filled the cabin like thunder softened by distance. "You're safe here." She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The coat he'd given her hung nearby, drying by the fire. On the table sat a tin plate with bread, cheese, and a cup of something steaming. "You made this?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. Ezra shrugged. "It's food, not art. Eat before it gets cold." She obeyed, and the warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the trembling that had haunted her since last night. He moved quietly around the cabin, feeding logs into the fire, checking his rifle, cleaning a hunting knife with almost ritual care. Every movement was steady, deliberate, precise. A man who had learned to live by rhythm, not chaos. When she finished eating, she gathered the courage to speak. "You said you'd make this right?" He nodded once. "I will." She hesitated. "They're dangerous men, Ezra. I don't want you hurt because of me." He met her eyes, calm and sure. "What they did wasn't about you. It was about power. Men like that only stop when someone bigger stands in their way." She swallowed hard. "And that someone is you?" A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Usually." Outside, the light had turned gray and restless. He threw on his coat, the scar on his face catching the firelight. "I'll be gone a few hours. Stay inside. If anyone comes near this cabin, you use this." He set a revolver on the table. Heavy, polished steel. "I don't know how to shoot," she admitted. "You'll figure it out fast if you have to." Then, without another word, he vanished into the mist. The silence he left behind was strange, not empty, but full of presence. Molly looked around the cabin again. Everything was built by his hands, the furniture, the walls, even the iron hinges on the door. He had lived alone for so long, yet the place didn't feel bitter. It felt waiting. Hours passed. She cleaned, unable to sit still. She washed the dishes, swept the floor, and folded the blankets, as if order could quiet her racing mind. When she finally sat by the window, she saw movement through the fog, a dark figure returning from the forest. Ezra emerged with 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder, blood on his gloves, a calmness in his stride that unnerved her. But when he caught her watching, his expression softened. "You shouldn't have waited by the window," he said gently. "Predators notice movement. I didn't want you to think I was afraid." He looked at her for a long moment. "Everyone's afraid, Molly. Brave people just don't hide from it." That night, he built another fire, roasting the rabbits with herbs she'd found in the pantry. They ate quietly, the storm of last night replaced by the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. Afterward, when she reached to take his empty plate, he stopped her hand, rough fingers, warm and steady. "You don't owe me servitude," he said. "I'm not serving you," she replied softly. "I'm helping. There's a difference." A silence settled between them, but it wasn't uneasy. It was thick with something unspoken, a fragile understanding blooming where fear used to live. Later, as the fire burned low, she whispered, "People call you the beast." He stared into the flames. "People like stories. Monsters make better ones than men." "Then they've never met the man," she said quietly. His eyes lifted, gray and searching. "Careful, girl. You're starting to sound like you believe in him." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I do." For the first time in years, Ezra Blackthorne laughed, low, rusty, like a sound forgotten by the world. Outside, the rain eased, and through the smoke curling from the chimney, the moon broke free. The days that followed slipped quietly into one another, marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of survival, the crack of the axe at dawn, the hiss of boiling water, the soft murmur of wind through pine. For Molly, time in Ezra's cabin felt different, slower, like the world had stopped chasing her for once. Her body still bore the bruises of what had been done to her, but they were fading now, replaced by something steadier: warmth, food, safety, and the strange comfort of routine. She helped wherever she could, cooking, washing, mending clothes, sweeping out corners long ignored. Ezra never asked her to work. He never ordered, never expected, never demanded. But each morning, when he found the floor swept or the shelves neatly arranged, a flicker of something softened his hard features. One evening, she caught him watching her as she brushed dust from the mantel. "What?" she asked with a nervous smile. He shrugged. "You've changed the place. It used to feel like a tomb." She turned to the fire, hiding the blush that crept up her cheeks. "It feels alive now," she said quietly. "You can't mourn forever, Ezra." He said nothing for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I wasn't mourning the dead. I was mourning the part of me that died with them." Her heart tightened. She didn't press him, but later that night, when he sat by the fire sharpening his knife, he began to speak, not to her, but into the silence. "My wife, Clara, and our little girl, June. Fever took them both the same week. I buried them behind this cabin. Couldn't leave after that. The town said I went mad. Maybe they were right." Molly put down her sewing. "You didn't go mad. You just didn't see a reason to go on." He looked up then, the firelight catching in his gray eyes. "And now," her voice trembled, "maybe you've found one." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full alive with something neither of them dared to name. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a quiet rhythm of companionship. Ezra taught her how to set traps, how to load the rifle, how to tell when snow was coming just by smelling the air. She, in turn, taught him how to make bread rise softer, how to mend torn shirts without new fabric, how to hum while working. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she'd glance at him, at his scarred face, his massive frame, his steady movements. He was terrifying, yes, but there was something deeply human beneath that armor, and sometimes, when she caught him watching her, humming at the stove or brushing her hair by the window, he'd look away too quickly, as though afraid she might see through him. One afternoon, she tripped while hauling a bucket of water from the creek, soaking her dress. Ezra rushed forward instantly, steadying her with hands that wrapped completely around her arms. "Easy," he murmured. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said, breathless. But he didn't let go. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, her wet dress clinging to her, his calloused fingers against her skin. The wind sighed through the pines, and time seemed to hold its breath. Then he stepped back abruptly, clearing his throat. "You should change before you catch cold." That night, she couldn't sleep. The warmth of his touch lingered, haunting her more than fear ever had. Days later, a storm rolled in, fierce and sudden. The wind screamed against the cabin, and thunder rattled the windows. When lightning split the sky, Molly startled awake, and found Ezra already standing by the door, shotgun in hand, watching the tree line. "Just wind," he muttered, though his eyes stayed sharp. She stood beside him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "You don't sleep much, do you?" He gave a faint smile. "Not since I learned nightmares don't only come when your eyes are closed." Molly looked at him, her heart aching with something she couldn't yet name. "Then maybe it's time someone stood watch for you," she whispered. He turned to her, truly looking at her this time, at her soft, strong face, at the courage that had survived so much cruelty. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with a quiet exhale, he nodded. "Maybe it is." When dawn came, the storm had passed. The air smelled of rain and pine sap. Molly stepped outside, the earth wet beneath her feet, and saw the graves behind the cabin, 2 small mounds marked by wooden crosses. She knelt beside them and whispered softly, "He's not alone anymore." From the porch, Ezra watched her, and for the first time in years, he believed it might be true. The peace didn't last long. It never did in Deadwood. By early spring, travelers began whispering about a fat girl living with the beast in the mountains. The story twisted with every retelling. Some said she'd been kidnapped. Others claimed she'd bewitched him. In a town built on rumor, truth didn't matter, only the drama of the telling. Molly heard it first from a peddler who'd wandered up the ridge selling lamp oil. "They're saying all kinds of filth down there," he told her as he packed his wares. "That you ran off with him after he took you." She went pale. "That's a lie." The peddler shrugged. "Lies travel faster than wagons, miss." That night she sat by the fire, wringing her hands. "They think I came here willingly, like I wanted—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Ezra set down his book. "Let them think. Words don't change who you are." "They could come here," she said. "Jake could come." At the mention of the name, Ezra's face hardened. He'd kept his promise and hunted Murdoch's gang that day months ago, leaving them broken and humiliated. but he hadn't killed them. Men like him, Ezra said quietly, don't forget a wound to their pride. For a few weeks, life carried on as before. They worked, talked little, and slept lighter. But tension hung in the air like thunder before a storm. One morning, as Ezra split logs outside, Molly came running from the creek. There were boot prints, she panted, fresh ones, more than one pair. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing. He's here. That evening, as the sun bled red behind the pines, 5 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Jake Murdoch rode at the front, grinning through a split lip that hadn't healed right since their last encounter. "Well, if it ain't the mountain freak and his fat bride," he called out, swinging down from his horse. "Heard you were keeping my property warm, Blackthorn." Ezra stepped forward, shotgun in hand. "You took from her once." "You won't take another thing." Jake spat into the dirt. "I don't take orders from monsters." He motioned to his men. They fanned out, guns drawn. Molly stood on the porch, trembling, but her fear had changed. She wasn't the same girl who'd begged in the woods that night. Ezra's voice was low, measured. "Last chance, Murdoch. Leave." Jake sneered. "Not till I finish what I started." The clearing erupted. A gunshot cracked the stillness and smoke filled the air. Ezra moved with terrifying speed. 2 shots, 2 men down. Molly ducked behind the doorframe, heart pounding, watching him fight like a force of nature. Jake lunged forward, knife drawn, slashing at Ezra's arm. The blade glanced off muscle. Ezra caught his wrist and twisted hard. The knife clattered to the ground. Murdoch snarled, "You think she wants you, freak? She's too scared to leave." That did it. Before Ezra could speak, Molly stepped out from behind the door. "You're wrong," she said, her voice shaking but loud. "I stayed because he's the only man who ever treated me like a person, and you—" Her voice broke into a shout. "You'll never hurt anyone again." She raised the rifle he'd taught her to use and fired. Jake dropped to his knees, shock frozen on his face, the pistol slipping from his hand. Ezra caught her shoulder gently as the echo faded through the pines. "It's over," he murmured. She stared at the smoke curling from the barrel. "I didn't mean to—" He took the gun from her shaking hands. "You did what you had to." By the time the sheriff's men came 2 days later, Murdoch's gang was gone for good. They ruled it self-defense. Word spread fast. Not about the beast, not about the fat girl, but about the woman who'd faced her tormentor and lived. When it was done, Ezra buried the bodies deep in the woods and said nothing. That night, he built a fire higher than ever before, and they sat beside it, not as savior and saved, but as equals bound by the same hard truth. Sometimes survival is the act of justice. The storm of violence left behind a silence so deep it almost frightened them. For days the mountains seemed to hold their breath. The forest that once echoed with fear now listened only to the crackle of fire and the faint clink of dishes in the little cabin. Molly barely spoke. She spent her mornings outside, standing by the stream, her reflection rippling in the cold water. She hadn't cried when Jake fell, but now, when the danger was gone, the tears finally came, quiet, endless, cleansing. Ezra gave her space. He worked in the yard, repairing the fence, chopping wood that didn't need chopping. He didn't know how to comfort gently. His life had been built on strength and endurance, not tenderness. Yet every evening he lit the lamp early, making sure the cabin was warm when she came in. One evening, As the sun slid down behind the trees, she returned from the stream and found him sitting on the porch, whittling a small piece of wood. "What are you making?" she asked softly. He held it up awkwardly. It was a carving of a bird, crude but careful. "Used to make them for my daughter," he said. "Helps me think." She sat beside him, hands clasped in her lap. "You think I'm a murderer now?" He shook his head. "I think you're someone who took back her life." The words broke something open inside her. "I didn't think I'd ever have one again," she whispered. "I thought all I'd ever be was what they called me." Ezra turned to face her fully. "I've been called worse, but names only have power if you let them stay." She looked up then, meeting his gaze. "Why did you help me that night, Ezra? You didn't even know me." He was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "Because I saw a woman who was still fighting even when she had nothing left. I saw what I used to be before I gave up." He hesitated, the scar on his cheek catching the last of the light. "And maybe I didn't want to be alone anymore." Molly reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. "You're not." He covered her hand with his, huge and calloused, but gentle as falling snow. "You've given this place back its soul," he said quietly. "You gave me back mine." The wind stirred through the pines, carrying the faint scent of rain. In that moment, they didn't need more words. The distance that had always existed between them, between beauty and beast, victim and protector, fear and hope, fell away. When the first drops began to fall, she leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. His arms came around her, strong and sure, holding her like something precious. Neither spoke, but both understood. The world had tried to destroy them, and instead it had made them whole. Spring came to the Black Hills like a slow forgiveness. The last of the snow melted from the ridges, and the river near Ezra's cabin ran fast and clear again. Wildflowers began to push through the thawed earth, bright and stubborn, refusing to die. So did Molly. Her laughter returned first, a sound soft but sure, echoing through the cabin as she cooked or hummed by the window. She'd gained her strength back, her cheeks full of color, her steps steady. The woman who had once begged for mercy in the woods now moved through the world like someone who knew her own worth. Ezra watched her quietly, always a little in awe. The cabin, once a grave of memories, had become something living again. He planted a small garden behind the house, and she filled the shelves with jars of preserves and books she'd bartered from passing traders. People in Deadwood began to talk again, not of monsters, but of the man who'd tamed the wilderness and the woman who'd tamed him. When Ezra rode into town for supplies, the same sheriff who once crossed the street to avoid him now tipped his hat. "Heard your wife's a fine cook, Blackthorn?" Ezra only smiled, a rare thing that made people look twice. "That she is." At dusk, Molly would sit on the porch with a shawl over her shoulders while Ezra split wood. Their little daughter Clara toddled between them, her laughter mingling with the wind. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned to gold, Ezra would look at his wife, her soft hands, her strong spirit, her eyes full of light, and think how wrong the world had been about both of them. "You're safe here," he'd whisper as he pulled her close, and for the first time in either of their lives, it was true. Some stories begin in fear, in darkness, cruelty, and shame. But sometimes those are the places where light learns to grow. Molly Brennan was broken, stripped, and left to die. Yet she found a man the world called a monster, and discovered he was the gentlest soul alive. Together, they proved that love isn't born from beauty or perfection, but from kindness, courage, and the will to see the good that others ignore. If you've ever been misjudged or cast aside, remember this. Someone out there will see you, truly see you, and call you worth saving.